Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Now recently I've noticed a lot of you asking for an updated Radeon RX 7900 XT versus GeForce RTX 4080 benchmark using the latest drivers with the latest games, as you plan on buying one of these GPUs for Christmas or you're hoping to land a sweet Black Friday deal next month. Whatever the case, I've got loads of fresh data for you, but before we get into it,
today's video is sponsored by ASUS and their excellent ROG Swift OLED PG27 AQDM gaming monitor. In our testing, we found the PG27 AQDM to be the best 27-inch 1440p 240Hz OLED monitor on the market. Not only does it feature the excellent black levels, lightning-fast response times, and per-pixel local dimming that we've come to love from OLED, but it's also the brightest model for HDR gaming with this panel that we've seen yet. This is a truly excellent display that delivers speed and motion clarity for multiplayer gaming, as well as stunning HDR visuals for single-player gaming, all in the one package. To learn more about the ASUS PG27 AQDM, click the link in the description below.
Okay, so as it stands right now, at the start of October, you're looking at having to pay at least $910 US for a 7900 XTX, with most models priced closer to the $1,000 US MSRP. But as an example, the Power Color Hellhound, that's available at $910 US, while the Sapphire Pulse can be had for $920 over at Newegg. So some decent discounts apply to those models. Then for the RTX 4080, you're looking at around $1,100 US for the cheapest model. The Gigabyte Eagle, for example, is $1,090 US, and the OC version is $1,100 US, while MSI's Ventus is $1,180 US. That said though, you will find the vast majority of 4080s still up around the $1,200 US MSRP. And that means the Radeon GPU is typically around 15% cheaper in today's market, which is what you'd expect given the MSRP of each model. So not a lot has changed on the value front there, at least the pricing front, but we do have new drivers and new games, so let's see how they get on. As usual for testing, we're using our Ryzen 7 7800X 3D test system with 32GB of DDR5 6000CL30 memory, and the display drivers used were GameReady 537.42 and Adrenal Edition 23.9.3. Okay, I reckon it's about time we jumped into the data, so let's do it. First up, we have The Last of Us Part 1, a game that's been heavily patched since the initial release, and performance here looks good using the ultra quality preset, and both GPUs are highly competitive. The RTX 4080 was just 4% faster at 1080p, while the 7900 XTX nudged ahead by a 4% margin at 1440p, and then by a more commanding 8% at 4K. Now, if we enable upscaling with the quality DLSS and FSR modes, we find some odd scaling with the Radeon GPU. Having triple checked the data, I consistently found that the Radeon GPU didn't render any additional frames at 1080p with FSR enabled. We're looking at basically identical performance to that of the native result. The RTX 4080 on the other hand, that saw an 18% increase once we enabled DLSS at 1080p. FSR did seem to be working as expected at 1440p though, boosting the 7900 XTX's performance by 22%, though we did see a more impressive 30% increase for the 4080. It was a similar story at 4K, and now both GPUs are seen delivering similar performance with just over 90 FPS. So something seems to be a bit of a miss here with FSR in The Last of Us Part 1. Moving on to the Remnant 2. Using the Ultra preset, we find the 7900 XTX is clearly faster, beating the RTX 4080 by a 13% margin at 1080p, 17% at 1440p, and then 22% at 4K. Overall though, performance was good from both GPUs, and it's really only the 4K results where the 7900 XTX was noticeably better, but of course we can enable upscaling, so let's go do that. Now with FSR and DLSS enabled, the margins do close up, though the 7900 XTX is still the faster of the two, offering 6% more performance at 1080p, 7% more at 1440p, and 6% more at 4K, so overall the experience was very similar. Next up we have Starfield, and this is a very pro AMD title. The results are mostly CPU limited at 1080p, but that's not the case at 1440p, and here the 7900 XTX was 12% faster and then 17% faster at 4K, which is quite a significant margin. And more crucially, this saw the Radeon GPU pushing over 60 FPS on average. Now, with FSR and DLSS enabled on the appropriate GPUs, we see no real change at the CPU-limited 1080p resolution, but the RTX 4080 is able to catch up at 1440p. Then at the 4K resolution, the Radeon GPU enjoyed a 21% uplift using FSR, while the RTX 4080 was boosted by 25% with the aid of DLSS. The end result being a 14% performance advantage going the way of the Radeon GPU. Moving on to Baldur's Gate 3 using the ultra quality settings, we find very similar performance between these two GPUs. The 1080p and 1440p results are CPU limited, but even at 4K, we're looking at almost identical performance in the city of Baldur's Gate. Now, with upscaling enabled, the 1080p and 1440p numbers remain much the same, but we do see a big boost to the 4K performance. The Radeon GPU, for example, saw a massive 60% increase, resulting in a 9% performance advantage over the RTX 4080. Testing Resident Evil 4 using the prioritized graphics preset, which doesn't enable ray tracing, we see that the 7900 XTX is slightly faster than the 4080 at each of the tested resolutions, though performance overall was excellent from both GPUs. Now, this title only supports FSR, so rather than test both GPUs with AMD's FSR technology, because that does seem to get you in trouble, I've enabled the maximum quality preset which uses ray tracing. And this saw the RTX 4080 nudge ahead at 1080p and 1440p by up to a 4% margin, while the 7900 XTX was just 4% faster at 4K, so very competitive results overall. Next we have the Callisto Protocol, and here the RTX 4080 and 7900 XTX are very evenly matched, delivering virtually identical performance at all three tested resolutions using the ultra quality preset. Oddly though, even with ray tracing enabled, we still find the same thing. Both GPUs are neck and neck. Normally, you'd expect to see the RTX 4080 nudge ahead with ray tracing enabled, but overall, performance was very similar despite the frame rates having been halved. Moving on to Far Cry 6, this is another game that only supports FSR, so we'll look at the native rasterized performance along with some additional ray tracing results. Using the Ultra preset, the 7900 XTX is 8% faster at 1080p, 14% faster at 1440p, and a massive 23% faster at 4K. Now, with the ray tracing enabled, we find that performance at 1080p and 1440p is CPU limited to just over 160 FPS, which is plenty of performance for this title, but at 4K, the Radeon GPU is still faster, delivering 14% more frames with an average of 108 FPS. Now, Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart has been tested using a few different configurations, and we'll start with the very high preset. Here the RTX 4080 was 6% faster at 1080p, 10% faster at 1440p, and 8% faster at 4K. So the GeForce GPU is clearly faster here, though there's not always that much in it. But if we enable ray tracing using the high quality settings, the 7900 XTX gets annihilated, rendering just 76 FPS at 1080p, making the 4080 an incredible 59% faster. Then at 1440p it was 61% faster and then 74% faster at 4K. Then if we enable upscaling, the RTX 4080 is seen delivering 48% more frames at 1080p, 54% more at 1440p, and 56% more at 4K. The 4K data is particularly impressive for Nvidia, as here the RTX 4080 was able to deliver a highly playable experience with 84 FPS, while the 7900 XTX was noticeably inferior with just 54 FPS on average. Next up we have Star Wars Jedi Survivor, and in this title, using the Epic preset with ray tracing disabled, the GeForce GPU was 6% faster at 1080p, 7% faster at 1440p, and just 3% faster at 4K. Then with ray tracing enabled, we find the RTX 4080 is just 3% faster at 1080p, though these results are a bit CPU limited, and then at 1440p it's 12% faster and 13% faster at 4K. So enabling RT does favour the GeForce GPU, but only slightly. Then with upscaling enabled, we run into CPU limited results at 1080p with around 110 FPS on average, and increasing the resolution to 1440p does alleviate that CPU bottleneck, handing the RTX 4080 a 13% performance advantage, so similar to what we saw prior to enabling upscaling, and then just 8% at 4K. Upscaling does appear a bit broken in Star Wars Jedi Survivor. This is another set of results that I triple checked, but it does seem as though FSR and DLSS don't really work that well here, as we're not seeing any real performance improvement with either upscaling technology. Hitman 3 is an older game, but it supports both ray tracing along with DLSS and FSR, so it was worth including. Using just the Ultra preset sees the 1700 XTX and RTX 4080 very evenly matched at 1080p and 1440p, but the Radeon GPU does run away with it at 4K, delivering 17% greater performance. However, if we enable ray tracing, it all goes a bit pear-shaped for the Radeon GPU, and now the 4080 is seen to be 18% faster at 1080p, 15% faster at 1440p, and 12% faster at 4K. Generally speaking, frame rates are very low with RT enabled, so let's try with some upscaling. In this example, both FSR and DLSS boost performance quite dramatically. The 4080 is now 21% faster at 1080p, though the 1700 XTX was also good for 100 FPS on average. We're also looking at an 18% margin at 1440p and 14% at 4K, so a clear win here for the GeForce GPU. Next up, we have F123, and we're going to start with the high preset, which is the highest quality preset you can enable in the game that doesn't use ray tracing. Under these conditions, the 1700 XTX is much faster than the RTX 4080, delivering 26% more performance at 1080p, 24% more at 1440p, and 21% more at 4K. But if we enable the highest quality preset, being ultra high, the RTX 4080 actually pulls ahead, albeit by a slim margin. But it's now 3% faster at 1080p, 4% faster at 1440p, and 8% faster at 4K. Then with upscaling enabled, we see quite a significant increase in performance, and now the 1700 XTX and RTX 4080 are neck and neck with no more than a 5% margin separating the two. Moving on to Forza Horizon 5, this is a title where RDNA 3 GPUs like the 1700 XTX had some performance issues early on, but that seems to have been mostly addressed at this point. The 1% lows weren't quite as good as what you'd expect when compared to the 4080, but performance overall was good, and the average frame rates were a bit higher using the ultra quality preset. Even with ray tracing enabled using the extreme preset, the 1700 XTX was generally faster, though again 1% lows were very similar to that of the RTX 4080. Still at 1080p, the Radeon GPU was on average 15% faster, 16% faster at 1440p, and 20% faster at 4K. Then with upscaling enabled, we find another example where FSR appears to be a bit broken on the 1700 XTX, as performance either stays the same or we even see a few dropped frames. Meanwhile, when enabling DLSS on the 4080, it gained 4% more performance at 1080p, 6% at 1440p, and 11% at 4K. So not a lot of extra performance, but DLSS does at least appear to be working. And in that 4K example, that meant the 1700 XTX went from a 20% lead to just 7% with upscaling enabled. Cyberpunk 2077 was tested using the latest version of the game, and with the high quality preset enabled, the 1700 XTX and RTX 4080 were very competitive. The Radeon GPU was just 5% faster at 1440p and 10% faster at 4K. But once again, if we enable ray tracing, the 1700 XTX's performance goes to hell, with just 61 FPS rendered at 1080p, making the GeForce GPU 46% faster. Then at 1440p it was 40% faster and 42% faster at 4K, though neither GPU was able to deliver playable performance here. Thankfully, FSR does appear to be working in this title, but so too is DLSS. So although the 1700 XTX was now good for 89 FPS at 1080p, the RTX 4080 was still 52% faster. It was also 46% faster at 1440p and 29% faster at 4K, so an easy win here for the GeForce GPU. Next up, we have Spider-Man Remastered, and here we find when using the very high preset, the performance is CPU limited at 1080p and even 1440p with the 7800X 3D to around 220 FPS, which is obviously still very impressive. Then at 4K we are GPU limited, but even here the 1700 XTX and RTX 4080 are neck and neck. Enabling ray tracing doesn't change the margins too much, despite reducing the overall frame rate. Both GPUs are very evenly matched, so RT doesn't cripple the Radeon GPU in this example. Now with upscaling enabled, we're almost entirely CPU limited when using the RTX 4080, even at 4K, which is pretty crazy. The 4080 saw a 32% performance boost with DLSS enabled at 4K, whereas the 7900 XTX only saw a 17% increase. So FSR is offering less of a boost here, which is odd as generally speaking DLSS and FSR scale about the same. That said, we have seen examples where GeForce GPUs actually scale better than Radeon GPUs when using FSR, so there's a very good chance that the 4080 would have delivered these same results using FSR, though image quality might not have been as good, especially at 1080p for example. Moving on to Fortnite, and we'll start with the DirectX 11 performance using the Epic quality settings. Now, competitive gamers generally use DirectX 11 as it offers the best frame consistency in Fortnite, and as such, the game's performance mode uses DX11. Here the GeForce GPU was 20% faster at 1080p, 14% faster at 1440p, and a massive 42% faster at 4K. However, the Radeon GPUs generally perform much better using DirectX 12, and we see that here, where the 7900 XTX and RTX 4080 are for the most part neck and neck. And we also have hardware ray tracing enabled, along with Lumen and Nanite, both set to Epic. Now, with upscaling enabled, we find some interesting results, though please note that the game doesn't support FSR, and therefore we're having to use TSR with the Radeon GPU. The RTX 4080 closes in at 1080p and manages to pull ahead at 1440p, though 1% lows aren't quite as good. Then at 4K, the 7900 XTX received a 47% boost with TSR, but the RTX 4080 only enjoyed a 33% increase when using DLSS, handing the Radeon GPU an 8% performance advantage at this extreme resolution. Testing Dying Light 2 using the high preset enables DirectX 11 by default, and here the 7900 XTX does very well, just edging out the RTX 4080 at each tested resolution, so that's a good result for AMD. But if we were to enable ray tracing, it's a totally different story, much like what we saw in Cyberpunk. The 4080 is now 39% faster at 1080p, 38% faster at 1440p, and 31% faster at 4K. So an easy win here for Nvidia, and as it so often is, the margin seen at 4K is very noticeable and makes the 4080 more usable. Then with FSR and DLSS quality upscaling enabled, the RTX 4080 was 36% faster at 1080p, 33% faster at 1440p, and 30% faster at 4K. So the upscaling margins slightly favored the Radeon GPU compared to what we saw at the native resolution, but overall they were very similar. The last game tested is Hogwarts Legacy, and with the Ultra preset enabled, the 7900 XTX was good for 146 FPS at 1080p, making it 11% faster than the RTX 4080. It was also 12% faster at 1440p and 14% faster at 4K, so strong performance here from the Radeon GPU. However, with ray tracing enabled, the 4080 does close in and even nudges ahead, so performance here is very competitive. And finally, with DLSS and FSR upscaling enabled, the results at 1080p are mostly CPU limited. At 1440p though, FSR provides the 7900 XTX with a 41% performance boost, while DLSS increased the RTX 4080's frame rate by just 19%, handing the Radeon GPU a 12% win here, with ray tracing enabled. The RTX 4080 does hit the lead at 4K though, besting the Radeon GPU by 12%. Across the 17 games tested when looking at rasterization only performance, the 7900 XTX was on average just 3% faster. The only real outliers were F1 23 where the Radeon GPU was 26% faster, and Fortnite using DirectX 11 where it was 17% slower. Now, earlier in the year, I put together a 50-game benchmark between these two GPUs and found that on average at 1440p, they delivered the same performance. And this time, with far fewer games, but with a number of newer titles and of course the latest drivers, the 7900 XTX ended up coming out on top by a 4% margin, though anything within 5% we typically deem to be a tie. Then at 4K, the Radeon GPU was 7% faster on average, which is starting to become a noteworthy margin. And if it wasn't for the massive loss in Fortnite, it would have almost got to double digits. Now, looking at just the ray tracing results, where we have 13 examples, the 7900 XTX was on average 8% slower. So the results have been flipped and then some. There are just too many titles where the Radeon GPU gets destroyed, such as Ratchet and Clank, Cyberpunk, and Dying Light 2, as the worst examples. And things don't improve at 1440p, and now the 7900 XTX was on average 9% slower, though a solid result in Forza Horizon 5 helped, and in close calls in titles such as the Callisto Protocol, Fortnite, Far Cry 6, Spider-Man, F1 23, Resident Evil 4, and Hogwarts Legacy all stopped the Radeon GPU from getting completely run over. Then at 4K we find more of the same. Here the 7900 XTX was 7% slower on average, and while there is some shuffling of the margins, overall the results are much the same. The biggest changes seen when looking at the Far Cry 6 data. The 7900 XTX goes from 1% slower at 1440p to 14% faster at 4K, so this could be down to memory bandwidth. Now, if we include the upscaled ray tracing data at 1080p, which cuts us down to just 10 titles, as not all supported DLSS, such as the Callisto Protocol for example, we find that the 7900 XTX is now 9% slower on average. That's not to say this is a scaling issue with FSR though, as the games list has changed, though we did see a few examples where FSR didn't behave as expected. Then at 1440p, the Radeon GPU slips to come in 11% slower, and again it's Ratchet and Clank, Cyberpunk, and Dying Light 2 where the 7900 XTX gets rolled. Finally, at 4K, the 7900 XTX was again 11% slower on average, and this result was helped by strong performance in Fortnite and Forza Horizon 5. So, as I noted at the beginning of this video, if we take the best pricing for each of these GPUs right now, the 7900 XT, it's at least 15% cheaper. There have been some recent discounts here and there, which gets it closer to 20%, which I think is probably the magical number for making this the go-to option in my opinion. And look, for rasterization performance, this thing is generally faster, despite being more affordable. At 4K, we saw that it was on average 7% faster, and there were a number of instances where the margin was over 20%. So that's certainly good for this card in rasterization. The margins at 1080p and 1440p, they were less significant, let's say, despite the 700 XTX having a slight performance advantage overall. So based on that, the Radeon GPU is great value, but if you're interested in ray tracing performance, things get much more complicated. With upscaling enabled, the 7900 XTX was on average 11% slow when it came to ray tracing, and we did see a few titles where it was more than 20% slower, with Ratchet and Clank being by far the worst example, though Dying Light 2 and Cyberpunk weren't pretty for the Radeon GPU either. So, taking all of that into account, I think it's fair to say that the 7900 XTX needs to be at least 15% cheaper in order to really compete for your money against the RTX 4080. An advantage of the 7900 XTX is the extra VRAM, going from 16GB to 24GB, which is a massive 50% increase, and on paper, that's a really good thing for the Radeon GPU. And I'm sure at some point in the future, it'll also prove to be quite handy, though I'm not sure it'll happen within the realistic lifespan of either product. So it's hard to say how much you should care about this at this point in time. Now, a disadvantage for the Radeon GPU is power consumption, and depending on the title, the 7900 XTX can increase total system usage by 15%, so around 60 watts, though in our day one review we found numerous examples where the power usage was quite similar, so power consumption shouldn't be a massive factor when comparing these particular models. The RTX 4080 though, that has the advantage of superior upscaling technology. It's not always miles better, but overall we found that DLSS does deliver the best image quality, especially at lower resolutions such as 1440p and 1080p if you have to use it there, though we don't necessarily recommend that. As we saw, the RTX 4080 generally delivers better ray tracing performance, and with the recent introduction of ray reconstruction, you could also be looking at better quality ray tracing, though that's yet to be seen. Ray reconstruction is a new feature that's not well supported yet, but we expect support to improve over the coming months. Then there's DLSS frame generation, which I feel is best described as a frame smoothing technology that can enhance the visuals with smoother motion, just as you would normally see with higher frame rates. We have found that frame gen can be handy for certain single player games if the base frame rate is already up around 60 FPS, allowing it to provide what looks like a high refresh rate experience, with the input of around 60 FPS, so not quite the same thing, not a true high refresh rate experience, but it can certainly enhance part of the experience. This technology can really only be applied to single player games, so if you're mostly into competitive shooters for example, all frame generation technologies at this point in time are pretty well worthless. As a side note, AMD has just released FSR 3. It's available in 2 rather unexciting games, and we are currently well into testing it out, and a video will be on the channel tomorrow. So I'm not going to say anything more about it here. At this point though, I should probably just wrap this video up. I will say that I think at a 15% discount, the 7900 XTX is a viable option and worth considering in place of the RTX 4080, but it's far from an automatic purchase for me. So with the cheapest RTX 4080s currently at $1,090 US, I think the 7900 XTX really needs to start at $900 for it to be my go-to option, and right now the Hellhound is almost there. So keeping all of that in mind, you should now know how these two GPUs need to be priced during events like Black Friday. So hopefully that helps. If it did, you know what to do. You can subscribe for more content, you can jump in the comments, let me know what you thought about the video, these two GPUs, and what kind of comparisons you'd like to see in the near future. We also have Floatplane and Patreon. You can sign up to either one of those things. You get access to our exclusive Discord server, monthly live stream for members only, behind the scenes content, and Q&A stuff. So a lot of cool things there. Check it out if you're interested, but if not, that's perfectly fine. And I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.